But now I want to tell you a little bit about the Guerrilla Foundation.
And keep in mind, we actually have a great crowd. So about 50 participants, participants from our Harvard Zurich program, and a lot of people who are really actually thinking about, do I need a foundation? How do I start a foundation? Why activism? What
exactly? Talk to us. So I want to start with a question, and I would love to answer you guys to answer in the chat a little bit. So what comes to mind when you think of like social movements and activism? Like, what are you thinking about? Because I mean, we already saw a couple of examples, but like sometimes it's kind of interesting to see what people actually, think. And I can't see the chat right now, so it's going to be interesting for me to figure out how to look at the answers.
We will update you as well. So should we start the poll? Or
no, it's just for people to chat. So write in the chat, what do you think? Like what movements, maybe individual activists come to mind? Gay marriage, civil rights, yeah. Black Lives Matter, Me Too. Sea Shepherd is a specific organization. Gandhi. Climate, yeah. Obviously, nobody could evade the climate demonstrations in the last, I would say, year and a half. Extinction Rebellion, we're going to talk about those guys. Labor movement, very important. Youth climate strikes, yeah. Indignados. And I'm in Spain right now. I'm in Barcelona, so that was really big here, obviously. Marshall Ganz as kind of an academic working on that in the US, yeah, very great thinker. Greta Thunberg, yeah. Women's March, yeah. And so basically, I mean, what you see from those answers, remember Greta, yes, we do. There is an activist political party actually here in Barcelona, for example, Barcelona and Camus, and we have indirectly supported them because obviously as a foundation you cannot support a political party, but you can support, for example, networks that have political parties as their target. So what we focus on, because of course when you think about activism, you also might have mentioned a couple of like, the neoliberal movement is also kind of like a movement that is carried forward by activists, you could say, so Friedman might be the core activist of neoliberalism. And so what we focus on with the foundation is social justice activism. So we really want to support creating large-scale social cultural institutional change. And we do that with like two main things in mind. So progressive values, first of all. So we do not want to support, like racist organizations, etc., that might be activistic, but that, are not in line with the values that we want to support, which is kind of like inclusion, sustainability, equity, and fairness, kind of as like the core progressive values. And then we work within the framework of the just transition. I'm going to just put this out here as a term, which basically in one sentence means that we want to help the transition from an extractive economy that we currently live in towards a living economy. And we want to help draw down power and money from a couple of elites to more the people. So, and that is a very broad description of that framework. I could go into that, into more detail on that, but I guess we don't have the time, or maybe we do that later in the questions.
Define extractive industry that we have today.
Exactly. So basically kind of transitioning out of that. And how could that look? And within this framework, you can fund two kinds of things very broadly. You can fund fighting the old, so fighting this kind of extractive economy, trying to point out its flaws, its failures, and where it really harms people. Or you can fund efforts to create the new. So you can fund, people building a different kind of economy, people caring for the commons, people building the sharing economy, etc. So you really have a lot of options, even within that field, to what you could actually support. And also what I really want to point out, because all the pictures that we usually use, because they just look nice and they really kind of, it's the image that you see is like people protesting on the street, you know? So some people might think that we're funding like revolts and revolutions and like just protests, you know? But it's very important to kind of keep in mind that quote from Martin Luther King, you know, like that it's not just about funding, you know, moving people, but also changing people and institutions. And that is really what makes the revolution. So really creating the kind of sociocultural change, the institutional change that is the basis for so many things. Yeah? So if you think about the environmental movement, for example, you know, it's not just about protests, it's about like making environmentalism so acceptable and over the last decades that it's now an investment opportunity. Basically.
Yeah, it's really about changing the narrative, right? Changing what
exactly.
we think is normal.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And if you look at this graph, this talks about the movement life cycle. So if you think about a social movement, there's usually kind of like a trigger event, you know, that kind of in a constant context of crisis kind of triggers people to go and protest and people to go and say, okay, this is really unfair, unjust, you know? And one trigger event in the UK, if you're from the UK, was the Grenfell Tower burning down, you know? And that really put on the agenda like that the right to housing and unfair housing conditions and the absolutely horrendous rental prices in London and generally in the world and the financialization of housing that drives all of this is a major issue. So you have this kind of one trigger event and then you go into kind of like in, first of all, protest and kind of like individual activists also becoming really prominent. But over time, you have an institutionalization of kind of activism. So it's also like, I'm showing this slide to show that there, again, there's like a very big diversity depending on when you get involved in funding something like this. You are faced with like more or less risky funding opportunities, you know? So of course, if you fund like the unstructured group, you know, that is not very kind of like institutionalized, that doesn't have an organization, and, you know, they are a couple of people that just organize a protest, it's a different thing than if you fund Greenpeace to do an action, you know, and point out like some climate sinners, you know, in a way that they have done like 25 times before. And somebody mentioned Black Lives Matter earlier, so that is a very good example for a very grassroots, uninstitutionalized movement that literally has been based on a hashtag and has been spread, you know, by a couple of young people that were just really good on social media, that were really good at bringing people to protest and like just putting that one issue out, you know, on the agenda, which is like, you know, Black Lives Matter. And they have been like super successful doing that, but they have no organization, or they had in the very beginning, like no organization that could be officially funded. So they relied really on kind of innovative, you know, funders and people, philanthropists who are kind of like a bit more risk prone to support them in the very beginning, because without money they couldn't have done this well, you know. So to go to kind of what we fund, so we're really looking at kind of bold European grassroots movements. So we fund only in Europe, and we are funding, I would say, more at the beginning of this movement life cycle. So we're really kind of going for the risky areas where, you know, the group is like very small, unknown, where it's not sure whether they're going to be successful, because we see that other funders are much more likely to fund them in later stages, you know. So we usually also kind of like signal with our funding for other foundations that this could be an interesting candidate. So it very often happens that we're the first funder for a specific grassroots group. And this photo here,
the first funder, so you're like the first one in.
Yeah, exactly.
Very
so
important.
the picture you see here is, for example, again, like relating to this Grenfell Tower example that I just used, a group that like literally mobilizes people to join a renters union in London. So they set this up super professionally, and they are organizing at the grassroots all over the city with like super diverse communities. They have materials printed in like 23 different languages, you know, to reach literally the people that live in bad housing conditions and organize them together to demand changes from landlords, but later also political changes.
So Romy, I'm sure everybody is right now asking themselves the same question. So you're the first one in, those are amazing movements. How do you find them?
They find us. So usually what happens is like we get loads of expressions of interest. So after 3 years in operation, we have kind of reached a status of being known in the field, and we have a question on our application form for people who apply with us to also point out other groups that they are aware of in their country, in their field, in other countries, etc., that they think we should be knowing about. So we kind of like do scouting, and we get, you know, referrals from former grantees, etc. But mainly it's literally like there's so much demand, and, you know, we could just live off the requests that we receive and literally just filter out the good ones from those. But we also do active scouting through a network of advisors, basically, that we have.
Good. Fascinating. So tell us about this network of advisors. How do you operate? Who are you guys?
I mean, so I would like to finish one thing before that. So to kind of go back to kind of what we're funding. So the second thing, next to funding these direct like protests, movements, you know, unorganized groups, we also sometimes make bigger grants to fund activism structures. And that could be kind of like trainings, that could be an app that someone develops that can be used by several organizations to mobilize people or to organize something. Or it can also be a network or kind of like gathering where people do cross-movement organizing, because it's super important to realize that, like, in the end, all of those issues, as Tony said with his root cause diagram, are kind of connected to patriarchy, to an acceleration of technological development, etc. So you have to unite movements on these overarching goals, and that's basically very important background work that usually is not as sexy, and that's why it's not ending up on the pictures and when people talk about funding activism. And the third, also very important, is storytelling. So kind of like helping people to share, for others to learn from their experiences, first of all, so share their stories, but also bring certain narratives to the forefront that are not necessarily mainstream. Something like degrowth, you know, as a concept, like, needs to be much more well known also in mainstream normal people environments, you know, not just amongst activists. So that's the three things that we do. And as Tony said, you know, we're a very small team, nimble organization. So I'm the managing director, we have a communications guy, and we have one grants manager. So that's how we work. And this would only be this is only possible because we have that network, and we have a couple of great advisors that help us basically, first of all, scouting organizations, but also that are involved in our decision making. So our board is actually active. It's not just meeting once a year for a nice dinner and a bit of a chat. It's really like we have a bi-weekly call where our board members are present to decide about grants above 10,000 euros. Smaller grants we decide in the team. All bigger grants are decided with board involvement. And on the board are, next to high net worth individuals, who, like Paolo, for example, who some of you might know, there's also a couple of activists. So we put them together because these are our two main constituent groups. So first, we want to convert more people of wealth and power to share their resources and learn about what it means to fund activism. And second of all, we want to be as participatory as possible in how we make our decisions and how we build our strategy also, to involve, like, from the very first time, like, activists in those decisions, to have, like, input, like, from the field, so to say, about, like, what should we be looking at, like, which areas should we focus on, how do we make our grants, how do we work with people, etc. So we just had our board meeting this week, virtually, unfortunately, and that's exactly the kinds of things we're discussing, you know. So how do we do our processes? How do we relate with grantees? What should we be looking at? Which grants did we make? Why were they good or not, you know? So it's a super active way of getting people involved.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Do you want to tell us a bit about the portfolio? How do deals?
Exactly. So basically, we make two types of grants. We have a reflex grant, which is super fast administered. Like, you just send us a request, and in a week you can have the money on your account, up to 5,000 euros. That's the grants we decide in the team, just because they need to be quick. And larger grants, 10 to 20,000 euros. So not massive grants, like Open Society Foundation makes like 150, 200,000 euro grants, you know, to established NGOs that have a big structure and loads of staff, etc. We give small grants to small organizations that are usually not very formal, in the sense of, like, being super non-hierarchical, sometimes not even being registered as an official organization. We have an overall portfolio of, like, about 500,000 euros a year, that would be great, a year that we spend. And we do a couple of grants that run over several years. We want to do more of that in the future. That also depends on the budget. So we very much invite people to support us also with our work. and kind of, exploring that field of kind of what are core organizations in Europe that really bring activists together for cross-movement organization, cross trainings also, so a couple of like essential structures that we could support in the long run to give people just like funding security, basically. And a couple of our selection criteria are, as I said earlier, like it has to be kind of like a very grassroots movement, basically. So we do usually not fund organizations, groups, people that aren't directly affected by the issues they're talking about. So you mobilizing some refugees, is not necessarily the same as refugees mobilizing themselves. So we really can try and look at that. And then we look for kind of bold initiatives that are maybe somewhat creative in raising a certain issue, that don't just use the same narrative or the same imagery as other organizations, like something that is a bit different and eye-catching, but also that talks about something that maybe other people don't even want to talk about. Catalytic, so early stage support, kind of really trying to find those that are going to build a big movement, in the future, or that are going to have a big impact with a small action. And we want people to have that bigger perspective of systems change. So we don't fund these so-called not in my backyard movements that are just like, we don't want fracking behind our house, and that don't relate their narrative to a bigger narrative about like fracking in general and an extractive economy, that is built on the fossil fuel extraction is not what we want. If you don't have that narrative, you shouldn't come to us.
Cool.
So,
what fascinating work that you guys have.
Having said that, I would love to do a little poll, if Aaron could start that, because as I said, we're spending 500,000 euros a year and we make relatively small grants compared to other foundations. And I would love you to just share what the overall percentage of philanthropic money you think is that goes into this kind of philanthropy. What are we talking about here?
You want to repeat again briefly what type of philanthropy you mean?
So what percentage of philanthropic capital goes towards this kind of social justice philanthropy that we are doing? So how much support goes to grassroots movements? Some say 10 to 25%, 1 to 10.
And I'm actually catching you off guard here, but what's the overall budget of philanthropic capital per year?
It's billions. Billions. I mean, just think about Bill Gates. So, it's a lot. But yeah, that would be actually interesting to have a number. So the winner is under 1%, and it's true. And usually people don't think that. Usually it comes out at like 1 to 10% at least, but it's literally depending on what study you look at. And there's only numbers available anyways for Europe and North America for these kinds of numbers. But it is literally under 1%. It's often like 0.4 or a bit less, sometimes something like that. And I think that's just crazy, because this, in our opinion, is kind of like the basis for all kinds of other philanthropic ventures, So if you think about investing in the setup of solar panels, that would be not possible without the environmental movement creating an awareness that, fossil fuel-based energy is maybe not the thing we want in the future. So, funding this kind of social-cultural change and funding people to connect and organize at a grassroots level is always the second thought, and it's always the last thing that people want to do because it is so kind of fuzzy and unclear, but it's actually super essential. And I think also right now, during the pandemic, we've actually seen how important that is. All those self-help groups that came up all over the place are impossible if you don't have an organized civil society. And you can really look at that. There's studies showing this, if you have a high level of association, a high level of, activism, like here in Catalonia where I live, it is incredible, what pops up when a crisis hits. Mm-hmm. If you don't have that, people are alone. It's this kind of individualistic, we're not talking, so we're not going to do anything together to support each other. And that's really needed. And I think much more in the future.
True. Fascinating work. So, in closing, what can
so
and how
basically,
can you?
if people want to support this kind of work, I mean, as I said, we make really small grants, and here's a couple of examples what you can do with 5,000 euros. You can double the number of people that participate in a climate camp in the Czech Republic. You could start one campaign in a certain city of Europe, that is talking about gentrification and really puts that on the agenda in a city like London, Barcelona, Berlin, where like property prices are just so crazy. The 90,000 viewers of like an award-winning video, that is the Rob Greenfield example that Tony shared earlier, or another one that we did on an airport expansion protest in France. Mm-hmm. So these kinds of videos, but also like narrative podcasts, videos and short films about successful projects that help people and that mobilize people to start something.
Good. And more?
And more, I can talk about our impact. So obviously this was like a webinar to say like, what impact can you make with social activism or just social justice activism? And I know that's always a big question, and someone also asked it in the very beginning in the chat, like, how do you measure the impact of someone like Rob Greenfield? It's obviously super hard. I mean, with Rob, you can actually even say, okay, he had X amount of viewers on YouTube. He had, so many people replicating the initiative that he actually talked about. So you could really track that, But in the end, you also don't know how many people, of the ones that watch it actually change their behavior, So it's really hard, especially also because we talk about long-term cultural change. How do you track, and of course you can, if you have the resources, whether degrowth as an ideology, as a concept, makes it from the academic world into the language of normal people, like how will we track after this pandemic, whether people start thinking differently about, like our global supply chains, for example, now that they've realized, that this is an issue and that this might be a very delicate point, if the next pandemic hits. So it's not the traditional impact measurement because you don't look at linear theories of change. You look at S-curves, you look at like creating a tipping point where then afterwards, like a lot of shit goes off. And the best example for that, I would say, is our funding for Extinction Rebellion. So we had been in touch with one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion from London. Before Extinction Rebellion even existed, we funded him with a couple of small grants, for example, a hunger strike. And so we knew this guy, and at some point he came to us with like a handwritten note on a piece of paper saying like, hey, I want to bring people in jail to point out the climate emergency. And, initially we were like, okay, you're a bit crazy, but we know you, we've funded you before. Let's talk to one of your co-founders to see whether you can actually pull this off. So we talked to the other co-founder and we were like, okay, she seems like super sensible and they actually have a good idea and they have a methodology that they thought about to train volunteers to find out those people that would actually be willing to get arrested and build a whole concept around it. So we were one of the first funders of Extinction Rebellion, to fund their first trainings for volunteers.
Amazing. Now see how far they've come, right?
Quite impactful, I would say. Exactly.
So for the last 11 minutes, let us get into some Q&A. What do you think about that? Is there last thing you wanted to say, though, before we do that? I've already pasted the questions here, Romy, so I can press.
I mean, I have a couple of things, obviously a couple of more examples I can talk about, but like we have this slide where we say, okay, if you want to fund activists, like that's the things you have to do. So you want to have to do it. You need to trust people. You need to let go of control and power because you don't know whether this is going to be successful. Again, it's about tipping points. It's about trusting in people, 2 people to start Extinction Rebellion. Right. Take chances. Reduce the paperwork as much as possible because activists don't have time for that stuff. Be creative. Be an activist yourself to figure out like what is actually relevant. I think that's super important. Be humble. And you have to be a badass.
Yes, that's what I want to hear. So let me press enter here, and we just have questions that came in. I think really thoughtful, awesome questions. First, thank you, Romy. And there was a very cool introduction to what you guys are doing, very early stage, high additionality, activists, funding. Now, Alexa, for example, posted a question that I think was very close to what you mentioned a couple times. How do you measure the cultural impact of the activists media that you sponsor? Romy, Tony, what do you say? Keep it short.
I mean, for me, it's really about over time tracking how the narrative shifts and whether terms like degrowth appear, for example, in mainstream media, and you can see that over years. And there is people doing studies on this. So for us, we actually do not track that because we don't have the resources and the time, but there is people who look at this. And that's what I mean with like to trust also, because you can't, if you want social cultural change, you can't have short-term outcome measurements being your measure of an impact, So as much as possible, we track, how many people do you mobilize, et cetera, but this is kind of like the stuff.
I maybe have something to add on this. I have a couple of slides I just briefly wanted to share. So the thing is that we're supporting grassroots movements that are very new, and they don't have a lot of resources to invest in collecting data and doing like qualitative and quantitative reporting. So we kind of let them set their own expectations and see how they perform against them. And there are also studies about how you measure the impact of activism, change in participation, change in social and political conditions, and how does this actually translate into concrete victories. So there are things that you can look into. It's just very complicated, especially for people that sometimes have a full-time job, and for them the activism is like what they do on the side.
Fascinating. Edwin asked a lot of questions.
Activist political party is Barcelona and Comú. Check them out. So what we also support is new municipalism, which is literally supporting platforms to be elected into city governments, because we also believe that the city scale is like a very important scale to kind of create change that is still feelable for people, to mobilize large amounts of people. And in Barcelona, there's a platform of kind of social movement, basically, activists that decided to get together and be elected. And now they put the mayor of Barcelona, and other people try to replicate that in other places. Amsterdam is a good example. They have a pretty similar platform right now in the government.
Maybe you can just write that in the chat.
Yeah.
Cool. Tony, anything from your side on that too? Are there any activist political parties?
I mean, I'm a supporter of the Green Party, but I mean, you just have to see in your area, what,
Got it.
What applies.
Municipalism is a global movement. So there is a website, fearlesscities.org maybe. I can share that. And also there's a question about like the winner takes it all. That is definitely a good question. So who are we to decide, in a foundation, in philanthropy in general? And that's what I mentioned with like, you have to be willing to give up power. So we also put part of our budget into a participatory fund for activists in Europe. So that is a platform for European grassroots activists where they receive money from foundations and they decide where the money goes. So we have no say in deciding, who gets the funding. And I think that is a big part of like moving, power in philanthropy. And we're like very much involved in that, like talking about this all over the place and really trying also with our board, having activists on our board, not just to decide about the grants, but also to build the strategy. I think that's a very important element of participation. Like, what are we actually doing, Lots of foundations don't ask that, and trying to mobilize other foundations also. Like, we really do a lot of work in like sharing what we do, how we do it. Someone also asked about would we consult with wealth owners to set up a similar foundation? We've done that. We just in the board meeting a couple of days ago talked about the Guerrilla Foundation in a box as a startup kit. So I'm super happy if someone wants to have a call to share. We have done this, share our decision-making procedures, share how we got started, etc. I'm very happy to do that because, yeah, we just really generally want to shift resources to this kind of philanthropy, and anything we can do to help with that, we're going to do.
So also if someone is interested in a particular topic, someone is, let's say, in the Netherlands and he wants to support an interesting social movement, very much happy to share our pipeline, so to speak, if we have interesting proposals. Exactly.
Yeah. We've also done that, like facilitating private donations basically to people that we select through our process. So you can kind of be sure that they are vetted and they've gone through our selection process, but like you make the grant.
And I think just on the power issue, because like what we do differently in the Guerrilla Foundation is we have activists sitting on our board. So we take decisions together, the team and the advisory boards, where everyone gives feedback. There's a discussion if we should do the grant or not, if we should reduce it, if we should ask more questions. So, and that is, I think, also a better way of doing philanthropy, this participative mode of philanthropy, instead of just having, the chairman that has the power and, like the Caesar says yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a very interesting question about putting serious money on funding social justice movements and not to think that the way of achieving big change is by impact investment. I think Falko said it in the beginning. I think it's both. You need impact investment to build these alternatives. So what I said earlier, you can fight the old and you can create the new. And creating the new is like, you need capital to build the new. But you need the social cultural change to happen before that, so that loads of people are willing to join and use whatever the new is, and to question things like geoengineering, for example, which is sometimes promoted as being part of building the new and is advertised as an investment opportunity, but where loads of activists would actually say we have to talk about not producing so much CO2 and not about how we can put it in the ground. So, that is where activism is really super important. And if you look at how much money goes into one and the other, it's just sometimes depressing.
There was this question also from Evan. Is it possible to join a group of high net worth activists, funders? Well, that's you guys, right? I think you shouldn't be shy, you guys. We could actually say that, some of the high net worths in your board are also in your board because they actually pool their resources together with Tony and really use this very strong vehicle, I think, that you've built with the Guerrilla Foundation, right? Because in a way you are relatively, of course, you have your costs, right? You have this process of sourcing, being the first ones into these amazing movements. But you would be more effective by the dollar if you would have more high net worths join you, right? So I think it's fair to say that you would be open for anyone who wants to join you guys in this effort.
Yes, we are very much inspired by the work of Resource Generation in the US that is organizing wealth holders around social justice philanthropy, going deep and creating spending plans, etc. And we are very much interested in bringing this type of organization also to Europe. Christina Johansson, who is also a wealth owner, and her family started a foundation that she's very much involved in. She will be speaking in one of our webinars. So we're actually with the Guerrilla Foundation also organizing webinars, which very much are targeted also at wealth owners and going deeper into social justice philanthropy. So anyone who's interested in those webinars can reach out to us. And together with Christina, we're also thinking about ways to bring Resource Generation to Europe. So we already started a group of funders in the UK that meet up weekly to talk about their wealth and what they want to do and which social justice groups they could be supporting, etc.
Wonderful. And there was.
I just shared a couple of links. So Resource Generation is definitely a great place to start. And we mentioned also Solidaire in the US is a donors collective that came out of Resource Generation. But also there's 1,000 Currents. They have a different name now. I will never learn this. I can share a couple more links for interesting things in the US. But that's the thing. There's a lot of this in the US, or more, comparatively more. In Europe, there's hardly any funders that would do this kind of grassroots work. And that is really crazy, actually.
Actually, was this question also from Alexa. I want to bring this briefly up again. Would you be open to supporting organizations that take on the regulatory and taxation regimes at the root of the creation of runaway inequality and human suppression?
Yes. We're looking there. The question is, how grassroots is that? So there is, of course, Positive Money, the tax justice movements, etc. They are very academic, very white male. Which is why we have so far not found an organization that we want to fund in that field, but it is a super important topic. It's just the question, how do you make that accessible and mainstream, and we haven't seen a bold proposal from that side, but we're looking. So if you know of anyone, let us know.
Well, I think this is a journey, right? To anyone who gets down the rabbit hole of impact investing, sustainable investing, philanthropy. I always think it's a little bit like pregnancy, Usually most people...
What do you know about pregnancy, Falko?
Nothing other than that it's a binary thing. Like, you can't be a little bit pregnant, usually, right?
That's true.
And that's once you realize the awesome power that capital has for the advancement of society, once you get that, I think you get the wheels turning and realize the amazing power that sits here, right?
Yeah.
In our capitalistic world that has great benefits to it, but of course also has challenges as any system that evolves. And I think this was a very important perspective that you guys brought in here. And again, I encourage everyone to reach out to you for more detailed questions, right? I'm sure there are more questions about such movements in other areas, for example, how to do this, how to maybe join you guys, learn from you. And thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. And
thank you, Falko.
Thank you. And I should not let it be unknown that also the CSP wouldn't exist without Tony, right? We wouldn't be here without you having put your foot down back then for us walking around actually in Cambridge, drinking tea, and you were like, yeah, let's do this. And the result is here. So I think, there's really a point to be made about being the first person in, right? And I think that's at the heart of it, what you guys are all about, right? Where can our money that can be placed based on conviction really have the biggest additionality, the biggest impact? And right, that's really the journey that you guys are on and that you have arrived with. I think it's absolutely fascinating and important. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Good. So we are, again, horribly late for Swiss terms. 2 minutes. So let's wrap it up in about 30 seconds to 60 seconds, handing over to our Swiss passport holder, Aaron, who I think briefly outlined that there are other such webinars coming up. Please join for that. I have shared the link here, and we would love to welcome everybody there again. Everything said, or Aaron, what else should we outline here?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. We only have, sadly, 2 webinars left in our webinar series, but we'll have another one after this. But the next webinar that's coming up is on faith-based investors and impact investing, and that's with our very own Teon Kwan, and she's also having a couple guests to be defined. And that's on June 16th from 4 to 5. That's Central European time, so whatever that is in your time zone. And if, Falko shared the link, so you can register there. But that's it. And thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone. And please know that the whole CSP team is also always here to facilitate these types of conversations. So if any one of the participants wants to set up such a course, such a webinar, be connected to anyone in the space, let us know. We are all friends. So without further ado, let us all go for a beverage of all types on our side for a summer evening drink. And thank you guys. Thanks, Romy, to Barcelona, right?
Yes.
Thanks, Tony, to Munich, I believe you are. Wonderful. Falko and myself, Aaron, are in Zurich. And thank you all out into the world and towards impact.
Cool. Cheers.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye, everyone.